Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. So, on our traipse through Active Directory, one of the subjects I've known that I'm gonna end up talking about is Active Directory certificate services. And we're getting closer to talking about that. But first, I figure it's going to be important to do a little bit of stage setting, as it were. By stage setting, what I really mean is me talking about some of the foundations for running a PKI and some of the things you need to be planning for if you want to even consider rolling out a PKI. Because this is one of those things that sounds and even to some degree looks simple in concept, and then the details start to kick in and you start realizing how deep the rabbit hole goes, and then you're falling down it and you realize that you still don't know where the bottom is. So yeah, first, PKI. Well, we know that that's public key infrastructure. And so this is very much about public-private key cryptography. One of those wonderful things that just permeates everything in computing because of how secure and how ubiquitous it is. And this is specifically about certificates, because I'm talking about Active Directory certificate services, or some of the underpinnings of that. So let's first think about, what do we need certificates for? Well, I mean, one of the easiest things we think of is certificates for web traffic, right? HTTPS, it's everywhere. If we think a little further, we go, okay, well, we also use certificates for securing email server traffic as well. And generally speaking, most people probably think, oh, you can use a certificate to secure just about anything you really want to. Yes and no. If you ever look at the actual structure of a certificate in its very base form, there is a usage field that specifies what the certificate can be used for. Some certificates can be used for things like identity validation. You know, I've got my USB stick here. It's got a certificate on it that proves that I am who I say I am because it was issued to me and I carry it. Okay. Wouldn't be very helpful if you were able to just take the certificate from a web server and say, hi, this proves that I am who I say I am. It's not valid for that. Same way around. If you take your personal identity certificate and put that on a web server, now I can read all the secure web traffic that comes through this server. Not valid for use in a web server. It's just not going to work. So, and this value, incidentally, is part of what's attested to by the certificate authority. So you can't forge that and still have the signature be valid. All right, so there's a lot of different usages for a certificate. And you can, in fact, specify your own. We'll get into OIDs a little bit further on in this video, but essentially it's not actually arbitrary. It looks like an arbitrary set of numbers that have a particular meaning. Okay, but because you can define your own usages for certificates, you can be very creative for that. You can have a usage specified, for example, for BitLocker network unlock. It requires a specific usage value in order to be valid for use to unlock disk encryption over the network. But like I said, this is something that has to be signed off on by the certificate authority. Their signature says, yes, this is valid for this purpose. Most certificate authorities are only going to sign a couple of very basic usages. Web server usage, web client usage, and the client one's actually going away. Some may also offer specific code signing certificates, certificates that have a usage value that permits them to be used for signing executables, program code, things like that. But you don't have anybody who's willing to publicly sign something that says, oh yes, this is valid for unlocking disk encryption across the network. It's not a standard thing. And so that is where you might end up needing to look at something like Active Directory certificate services, setting up your own PKI in order to issue certificates that you can then use for other applications that are just not supported by public certificate authorities. So what's involved in setting this up? What are some of the things that you have to think about? If you think about your architecture of a certificate authority, it's not actually just one certificate authority. You can have a single standalone server that you says anything that's signed by this server is trusted. Okay. How does anybody trust that? Well, it's the root certificate authority. Okay. Which means that there is a self-signed certificate that the root certificate authority has created attesting to its own identity. It's self-signed, and you install that into all of the computers that need to trust it, and then anything that that certificate authority has issued becomes trusted. Okay, but is that really secure? If you have a single certificate authority, what happens if it's compromised? What happens if somebody gets onto it, issues a bunch of certificates that are actually malicious in nature? Within Active Directory, for example, if all of your workstations trust that root certificate authority, and somebody decides to log on to that certificate authority and issue a certificate for google.com, that will be trusted by all of those machines. Maybe not everything on the internet, but everything internally will trust that, oh yeah, this is google.com. It's signed by a trusted root certificate authority. That may not be what you want. If you're running a web filtering platform that is doing HTTPS inspection, this is exactly what you want. But you really need to be careful about how you set that up, because then, yes, whoever has a certificate signed by this certificate authority will trust it, no matter who it says it is. I'm your bank. I'm the government. I'm Google. I'm Microsoft. I'm your platform manufacturer. Hi, I'm Windows Updates. All of it will be trusted, whether it's actually valid or not. So a root certificate authority is a high-value target in a network for anybody who's compromised it. And you really, really don't want it to be compromised, because that'll do a lot of damage and it will require a lot of work to recreate your entire PKI. It would be a nightmare. So a common thing that we do is say, well, let's keep the root CA offline. It doesn't need to stay online where people can reach it. Having it turned off is the best way of making sure that it cannot be compromised. Turned off and not connected to network. Okay, but then what do you do when you need to issue a new certificate? Do you need to turn the root certificate authority back on every single time? Well, what you actually end up doing is you end up with a hierarchy of certificate authorities. You have your root certificate authority, sure, but then you have an intermediate certificate authority. And that one stays online. The intermediate CA is signed by the root CA so that there's trust established there, but then the intermediate CA can stay online and issue certificates and do the day-to-day business, essentially, of running or managing the PKI. Okay, so that's at least 2 servers we need already. Before we've done anything else, we need 2 servers, a root CA, which is never going to be connected to network and will be turned off completely when you don't need it, and an intermediate CA that is actually going to issue all the certificates to your endpoints. And you might choose to have multiple intermediate CAs. Maybe, if you're in an enterprise, maybe that's what's necessary. For small to medium businesses, I mean, most people will look at it and say, are you telling me I need at least 2 servers for this? Yes, and more. So let's keep going. Now let's think about what makes a certificate valid. It's within the correct dates. It's for the correct, identifier, whether that's a DNS name or something else. An email address, if it's an SMIME certificate, for example, but it needs to be for the right identifier. It needs to be for the right usage. It needs to be signed by a trusted CA. Okay, fine. Think back to when these were computationally expensive to set up. You maybe had a certificate issued once every year, 2 years, 3 years. How do you know that it's still valid at any given point in time? Do you just rely on the date? There's a process to revoke a certificate that was either issued in error or one that you believe to have been compromised by some attack. You can revoke the certificate and say people should not trust this anymore, rather than relying on the date. Okay. So there needs to be some way of informing end users and workstations that a certificate may have been revoked or that it's still valid. So what happens if you have a certificate revocation list and, you've revoked a certificate? Nobody should trust this anymore. Can't an attacker just block access to that revocation list? And workstations will go, oh, well, I don't see any evidence that it's been revoked and the date's still good, so I should still keep trusting it, right? So then you get into the whole thing around a CRL, or a certificate revocation list. This is separate from the certificate lifetime. And the CRL needs to be available because the defense against the attack of, hey, the attacker can just block the CRL is, hey, if you can't reach the CRL to verify the certificate's validity, consider it invalid. It's been revoked. You don't know for sure that it's been revoked, but you can't talk to the source that actually publishes the revocation list. So, fail secure. Don't trust it if you can't verify that it hasn't been revoked. Okay, so your certificate revocation list is going to have to be somewhere where clients can get at it to verify it. And that includes for your intermediate certificate authority, right? Let's say you're doing a fairly standard setup. Your root certificate authority is going to have a certificate that's valid for 20 years. I never want to have to touch this again. Okay, sure. And of course, because you're following good practice, your intermediate certificate authority has a much shorter lifetime, 5 years. Okay. But how do all of the clients know whether that intermediate certificate authority is still good or whether it's been revoked? The root server, the root certificate authority, has to issue a certificate revocation list. And typically, this is with a lifetime of something even shorter than the certificate lifetime, so 1 year. Okay. But the root certificate authority is kept offline. So how are people going to get it? You need another server to publish this. And for reasons of attack surface, it's not good to have something like a web responder, an HTTP access endpoint, or a certificate share, or anything else like that hosted on your intermediate certificate authority, which means you're now up to 3 servers required. You need your root certificate authority, you need your intermediate certificate authority, and you need an online responder that hosts the CRL, any Delta CRLs. If you're using if you're using OCSP, online certificate signing provider, I believe is what it is. All of that goes on a 3rd server. It becomes your AIA, or your Authority Information Access Point, which is published in the certificate. Every certificate has an AIA, so that when you're looking at the certificate, you know where to go to find the authority information. Here's where you find, my authority. Here's where you find the certificate practice statement and all of the other bits and pieces that are necessary for a fully fledged PKI. All right. We haven't even gotten into the actual building of anything yet, and we're already realizing that just to deploy this in its most basic form, we need a minimum of 3 servers. Minimum. Okay. So if your root certificate authority is kept offline, but your CRL is only valid for 1 year, that means you need to turn your root certificate authority on at least once a year to publish a new CRL. And then because that has no network, you actually have to, physically take that file, that published CRL, remove it from the root certificate authority, shut that back down again, take it over to your online responder, and put it there again so that everybody can see, oh, there's a new certificate revocation list. The intermediate CA is still valid. And your intermediate CA has to publish its own certificate revocation list saying, these are all the certificates that, have been revoked. And if it's not on the list, then, hey, it's still valid. Cool. This is a lot of infrastructure that if you miss a part of it, things start to break, or you get compromised, which is never, ever what you want. So there's a lot of moving pieces to this. I mentioned OIDs earlier, and it turns out that a lot of these attributes are delivered and specified in the terms of an OID, which is an organizational identifier. OIDs look like a huge string of numbers separated by periods at intervals. There's a very complicated method of assigning these numbers. Some are assigned by country. Some are assigned by organization underneath a country. Some are reserved by, like, ICANN for internet architecture and such like that, so they don't belong underneath any particular company. But you might end up with an OID that is, a country portion, a region portion, whether that's a state or a province or what have you. You might have an organization section. Then you might have a section that breaks down the business units within the organization. Then you might have another section that delineates, and it just keeps branching. But there are some things that come as OIDs. Your certificate usage is an OID. If you're doing one for BitLocker Network Unlock, it's one that comes under Microsoft's organizational identifier. And one of the other things I mentioned, a certification practice statement, also has to be under an OID. It has to be identified by an OID so that it can be encoded into the certificate. If you want to know how and why we issue certificates and how we verify them and how we authenticate them at the time of issuance, here's where you go. This is the OID under which it can be found. And you actually have to put together a certification practice statement so that people know, hey, yeah, we've actually put some thought into this. It's not just some rinky-dink operation. Because you can say, well, that certificate's valid, but I don't trust you to actually have validated anything, so I'm not going to trust your valid certificate. If you want people to trust it, you have to actually specify how you're doing your work so that people know this person can be trusted. He's done his homework. That comes under an OID as well. You can register for an OID. Some countries farm this out to a private organization or even a nonprofit organization, but maintaining this list for everybody does take people's time and effort. So there's usually a cost associated with that. You can register for your own OID, but it's going to be $600, $900, something like that. You can possibly use an OID that is in Active Directory, because every Active Directory domain has a unique OID. It's underneath Microsoft, which means, hey, you know, if Microsoft suddenly declares that this is not valid anymore, then your OID may go away. But for many small businesses, if you need certificate services at all in a small business, they're probably okay with that. It's probably not a huge risk that Microsoft is just going to, with one stroke of a pen, declare everybody's domain OIDs are invalid. But it's something to consider. And if you need OIDs for anything else in a company, and I'm not just talking about in IT, because remember, an OID for an organization can be broken into different units. Maybe marketing needs something. Maybe the division of your enterprise that handles certification to international standards needs some OIDs so that they can actually list this in an approved manner for the standards licensing organization. So this is something that you really need to look at a higher level than just within IT. That's an interesting conversation to have. Or if you're pretty sure, nah, the business is not going to need that for anything that they're doing. And if they do, then it's something we can cross 20 years down the road. Okay, fine. Then maybe you just use the OID from Active Directory and you're good. But, there's always another but, not all of your certificate authorities have to be Active Directory joined. And if your root CA is offline, as it should be, then that probably does not join Active Directory. Because if it's offline for a full year, it's not going to have any up-to-date information on the domain when it turns back on. Further, it's never going to join the network, right? Because it's air-gapped. You don't want that on the network, and it's going to stay offline. So that becomes a standalone certificate authority. But your intermediate may be part of Active Directory because it wants to be able to receive certificate requests through Active Directory. So you might end up with a mixed architecture. Here's one that's standalone. You can also do an intermediate that's standalone if you're running in a work group and there's no domain at all, which is where Active Directory certificate services, it becomes a little bit of a misnomer. They've branded this with Active Directory, but it does not require Active Directory. It doesn't require a domain. It's just the brand name that they've given to certificate services, a PKI implementation. So there you go. Active Directory certificate services may not require Active Directory, definitely requires at least 3 servers if you want to do it right, requires possibly the involvement of departments within the organization other than IT, and requires thinking about a whole host of other gotchas, possible attacks, countermeasures, a lot of stuff. Which is why setting up a PKI is not for the faint of heart. It really isn't. Don't do this. Don't start this journey unless you're willing to dig real deep. And the deeper you dig, the further you realize you still have to go. But if you're a security wonk, kind of like me, then maybe that's a really interesting rabbit hole to chase down and go, okay, where do all of these tunnels go? Where are some of the cool things that can be done? It's going to take a lot of time, and this is one where you really want to do your homework. If you create a certificate authority and upload that root certificate into Active Directory, everything will trust it. And pulling it back out from all of those machines is a lot of work. If you do that and deploy it and then go, oh, I did it wrong, whoops. Now you've put yourself on the hook for a lot of extra work, and it's not going to be fun. It's really not. This is one area where I overplan. I absolutely overplan. I go over things 5 or 10 different times before I run even a single command, because I want to be ultra sure I know what I'm doing every step of the way, because I don't want to have to say, oops, I really shouldn't have done that. Now I need to redo everything. That would be bad. So yeah, there's my final warning on the subject is be really sure. Be really, 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 really sure about what you're doing before you do it when you're talking about certificate services, because otherwise you're highly likely to make a mistake that is really painful to address and may not be able to be addressed easily at all. Okay, that's enough for today. So hopefully you found that enlightening, interesting, thought-provoking, all of those. That would be wonderful. If you have thoughts on other things that you would like to hear me talk about or things that you would like to see me demonstrate, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door netadmin, and we will see you next time.